Hello, hunters, and welcome back to Super Fan Natural. Adaptation. It's an important part of not only evolution, but also art and fiction. There's only so much humans can invent whole cloth. So, taking what already exists and giving it a new twist is a key method for making new art. As a lifelong fan of monsters, mythology, and folklore, I love seeing new versions of old creatures. And that's something that Supernatural has plenty of. The show has a distinct style, one that prioritizes explaining how monsters can exist in the modern world without being detected by general public, and that usually involves giving them a more human appearance and grounding their abilities a bit. Supernatural didn't invent this style, and it's not for everyone. But, personally, I enjoy how the writers reimagine most of the creatures. Keyword being most. There are definitely times when I feel like they dropped the ball, either because their interpretation fails to really capture the essence of the source material, or because it's just kinda dull. In this video, I'll list the 5 monsters that I feel the show done did the dirtiest, and I'll not only explain why I believe that, but also how I would have personally done things differently, because you can't offer criticism if you don't have your own ideas. In order to keep every fix from just being, don't include this creature, or better effects, I'm going to try to suggest the most minimal changes that I feel would be necessary to make each beast at least a little bit more palatable while still preserving the show's style. It's important to keep in mind that these are just my opinions, and this will be a very subjective list. There's probably going to be inclusions that you don't agree with, as well as ones that you would have included that I didn't. For example, I'm sure plenty of people were upset by how the show portrayed Jin, but I don't really mind them. I actually think that they have a cool and unique gimmick, though I'd be lying if I didn't admit that part of that has to do with the fact that I just don't have that much of a cultural connection with these creatures. Also, I'm going to be complaining in this video, but it's all just for fun. It's not condemnation of the show, nor a reason to harass anyone who worked on it. We'll kick off the list with the entry that everyone who's seen the show is expecting: dragons. Supernatural's version of dragons is infamously poo-pooed by a good chunk of the fandom, and it's not hard to see why. Dragons are one of the most popular fantasy creatures ever, and that's at least partially because they're usually depicted as larger than life, awe-inspiring, the definition of fantasy awesomeness. Because of that, it was always kind of questionable whether the show would take a swing at them, but they went for it, and what they settled on was a couple of guys in black t-shirts with pointy fingernails and extra spicy hot hands, and for a brief moment, one of them had glowing eyes. Now, it's pretty much confirmed that this is just a disguise, and that they have a true form that's more, dragony. We don't see that, but one of their victims described their attacker as a giant bat, and we're given a very brief glimpse of wings and scaly skin, and really, if I'm being 100% honest, that might be good enough for most of the other monsters in the show. However, these are supposed to be dragons, creatures whose appeal is intrinsically tied to them looking awesome, and who also aren't super commonly associated with taking human form. Now, look, I get it. This was a show on the CW in 2011. Smaug probably wasn't in the budget, and bad CGI can be really rough. But then, don't have dragons. So how would I have made this work? Well, honestly, I would have just shown off a little more of their true form. And there's a couple of ways that this could have been done without having to splurge on CGI. The easiest would have been to use a trick that the show regularly used to show creatures that they aren't going to bring to life. Show off a drawing or painting of it. At several points in the show, characters will whip out an artist's depiction of a creature's true form, and that's all we really get, and so we're left to assume that it's at least somewhat accurate. Now, obviously, there's a lot of dragon art out there. However, this episode has the absolute perfect excuse to show off a quote-unquote accurate picture of the beasts. When Dean visits Dr. Viziak, I would have had him notice a painting on her wall that depicts what dragons really look like. It would make sense for her to have something like that, since she collects rare dragon-related items, and also she was secretly a monster, so she could even have painted it herself. I would have also thrown in a line about how they used to be these giant creatures. However, once the swords were made and they were no longer invincible, they chose to change in order to hide better. During the fight in the sewers, I would have had them breathe fire at least once. I know that's another effect that can be real bad if done poorly, but there's plenty of ways to shoot around that. Finally, if there was a little bit of money on the table, I would have had the dragons that get poked revert to their true form upon death. Then you can use a costume or a model or even CGI. It's not going to move, so you have options. I don't know, maybe I'm being too picky, but dragons are one of the creatures I really expected to be more than just a guy. We're going to stay in Season 6 for our next entry, as we cover another Harry Potter creature that the show tackled in 2011, the Phoenix. Like dragons, this is another weirdly high fantasy creature for the show to adapt. But there was a lot of potential there. I mean, come on, a creature that bursts into flames as it dies and is reborn from the ashes? There's so many ways you could do that. And while phoenixes are usually depicted as birds, I feel like by season 6, and especially after seeing the dragons, most fans expected it to just look like some guy. But we were wrong. It looked like a cowboy. A cowboy whose touch could reduce people to ashes, and who burned down into ashes himself after getting popped by the cult. You may notice that I haven't mentioned anything about him being reborn from the ashes, and that's because nothing like that ever happened. The cowboy phoenix did survive a hanging, but that doesn't really feel all that special since most monsters can survive conventionally fatal boo-boos. So yeah, that's the main reason why it's on this list. They left out the most pivotal aspect of its lore. Like, I'm open to the idea of vampires without fangs and who aren't hurt by the sunlight, but if your vamps don't feed on human blood or something, then I'm gonna question what exactly makes them vampires besides the name. It's the same thing here. When it comes to symbols of resurrection, phoenixes are rivaled only by Jesus, so people are gonna notice if your phoenix doesn't have anything to do with rising from the ashes. So how would I do it? Well, assuming that I have to keep it in the show, and I can't just make it look like a bird, I would change how it kills people. You know how the phoenix burns up after getting hit by the cult? I would have something like that happen whenever it takes any kind of critical damage. Like in the scene where the judge gets got, I would have him grab a knife and jab the monster in the heart, and in response, the creature's body starts catching fire, and it's soon completely engulfed in flames. It then grabs the judge, causing him to also burn up, and after a moment, they're both left looking like Pompeii people. The judge's body collapses into dust. However, the phoenix's scorched flesh falls away and reveals a completely restored body underneath. He then takes the judge's clothes and runs off, leaving behind 2 ashen piles, one of which looks vaguely bird-shaped. The same thing happens to the sheriff, and beyond that, the episode would play out almost entirely the same. I personally feel like this one change does a lot to make the creature feel more like a phoenix. Our next entry is the only one in this list that isn't technically a monster by Supernatural's definition. That's ironic, since the source material was known as the monster, more specifically, Frankenstein's monster, or just Frankenstein, which also works. Frankie is somewhat unique among popular monsters, as he doesn't really come from old-timey folklore, instead originating from a 19th century novel. Still, because most people know Frankenstein from the 1930s movie, you might be surprised to learn that the original version doesn't have green skin, a flat head, or bolts in his neck. He's still ugly though, described as having white eyes, black lips and hair, and semi-transparent yellow skin. Also, while the movie version is made of stitched-together body parts, the book isn't really clear about how he was constructed. The original version is much smarter and more proactive, and after being rejected by humanity, he tries to force Doc Frankenstein to build another creature to act as his companion, which ultimately doesn't happen because Vic figures that this could only lead to bad things. Still, while there are plenty of differences between the two versions of the story, both carry themes about the dangers of man playing God. So, how did the show spin this classic universal monster? Well, first, instead of one Frankenstein, the show went with a whole family of Frankenstein, here shortened to Stein. The Steins are an old and powerful family who are stated to have been part of many world events, including 9/11? They are normal humans, at least at birth. However, over time, each member is enhanced by stealing body parts and surgically implanting them onto themselves, which make the Steins stronger, tougher, and possibly lets them live longer, since they can replace damaged parts. I said before that the whole body parts stitched together thing may or may not have been part of the original story, but by now it's become a staple of the monster, so in that regard it fits here. However, that's kind of the only thing about them that's related to the original Frank. If I absolutely had to keep the Frankenstein family in the show, I wouldn't have had them be a biological family, but rather something closer to a cult that is led by the original Frankenstein's monster. Like, the source material Frank would have been a creation of mad science, except here he would have been brought to life by dark magic from the Book of the Damned. After his creator died, Frank couldn't read the whole book, so he couldn't make another like him. So instead, he spent the last century or so trying to figure it out, all the while creating a kind of surrogate family by finding lost souls and giving them bio upgrades. Charlie would still steal the book from him, and the episode Book of the Damned would play out pretty much the same. But after the random goons get got, then the monster himself would go after the book, and he would be the one to take out Charlie. From there, the story could play out pretty much the same if you wanted, or Frank could stick around for a while, and there's lots of possibilities there. especially going into Season 11, which revolves heavily around themes of God and creation. This next entry is one that I might actually have to explain just a little bit, because it's a monster whose origins aren't in Western myth. Instead, the Kitsune come from Shinto mythology, aka Japanese folktales. In Shinto lore, Kitsune are a race of magical creatures whose true form appear as a fox that can have up to 9 tails, with a number of tails representing their age and power. Their exact nature and abilities can vary story to story, but common elements include the ability to shapeshift, at least into human form, and a sharp intellect, which they can use to either help humans as wise magical guides or mess with them as malicious tricksters. The trickster angle is definitely the one that I'm most familiar with, and it's also the one that I feel would fit the show the best, but there's plenty you could do to make these creatures an interesting part of the show's lore. So what kind of spin did the writers put on this staple of Japanese folklore? Well, Kitsune in Supernatural look like regular humans most of the time, but in their true form, they grow claws and slit pupils. They're super strong, and they eat brains to survive, and that's it. That's all the show gives them. I hope you can understand why I feel this is a bit lacking. This is another case where there just isn't much to identify the monster beyond people just saying that's what it is. Additionally, there's not really anything unique about the Kitsune within the show. Like, their nails are longer and they eat brains, but really, they just feel like a reskin of werewolves. At least dragons and phoenixes had something unique. Like, even if you can't tell that that's what they're supposed to be, you know that not every monster can fly or melt people. By contrast, Supernatural has a really bad reputation for turning monsters into regular people with just having weird teeth and eyes and nails, and I kind of feel like this is one of the worst cases of that. My version of a Kitsune would spend most of their lives looking like regular foxes. However, every few years they would be able to take on human form, and they would have the opportunity to gain another tail by convincing several people to opt out so that the monster could feed on their brains. Their tails, which would probably look like tattoos in their human form, would give them special powers, and once they got 9, they'd be able to change at will and would be practically immortal and really difficult to destroy. You could keep the story of the episode pretty much the same. Sam met Amy as a kid during one of her family's human cycles. She convinces him that she's a good noodle who doesn't want to hurt people, and later saves Sam from her mom. Then, in the present, he recognizes the pattern and goes to confront her. But she reveals that she's had a kid who got sick, and getting a tail was the only way to heal him. Sam agrees to let her live, but Dean ganks her later because he doesn't trust her. I really feel like making lying and trickery integral parts of these Kitsune's nature would make it more believable that the boys, especially Dean, would distrust Amy so much, since she could have just been manipulating them the whole time. You could cast more doubt on her character by showing that, despite her claims of never attacking people, she does have one more tail than last time, and while she claims it was self-defense, it's never confirmed, leaving it up to the viewer to decide. You wouldn't have to show anyone turning into foxes, though there could be a shot of Kid Amy already in fox form running off into the woods after Sam let her go. Look, I'll admit I'm not an expert on Kitsune or Japanese mythology in general, but if nothing else, this would help Supernatural's version feel like a unique creature. Okay, so the first 4 on this list disappointed me, but this last one, well, it straight up irritated me, and not just once, but multiple times. See, I'm a big fan of werewolves. They're one of my favorite legendary monsters. I absolutely love the idea of a werewolf transformation. I mean, turning into animals is cool, but changing into a deadly wolf-man monster? That's certifiably metal. What makes them extra fun is how creative you can get with them. Their wolf form can look more human or more animalistic, maybe somewhere in the middle. The transformation can be triggered by any number of things, or it can be voluntary. Though I personally like it when it's more of an involuntary curse. There's a lot of ways to make werewolves interesting, and only a few to do them wrong. Thing is, I feel like Supernatural chose the bad options, and over the course of the series, they just fumbled more and more. The problems start the very first time we see werewolves, when it's revealed that they don't actually turn into wolf monsters. Not really. These were the first monsters to really feel the sting of the show's dedication to avoiding costumes, as instead of really changing, they just got weird teeth, eyes, and fingernails. So that's a pretty big red flag right off the bat. Pretty much the coolest thing about werewolves, gone, just not gonna do that. However, despite that massive gripe, there's still something here. After all, they might not change into wolves, but at least their feeble change is involuntary, and they don't really have any self-control, so the condition is still a really scary curse. That was true for the first werewolf episode. However, the next time we see werewolves, the show decided to introduce the concept of purebloods. Purebloods are werewolves that were turned within the first few generations of the alpha. So basically, Eve made the first werewolf, then they turned some people, and then they turned some other people, and they turned others, and if you fall into one of those generations, you get to be a pureblood, which comes with some perks. Namely, they have almost, if not complete control over their change, basically turning the curse into a superpower, with just a handful of downsides. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad addition. I mean, it's kind of cool to have this disparity where some wolves have complete control and others have none. However, after Season 2, we never see a regular werewolf again. So basically, no more tortured souls, just weird-looking goons who show up to get blasted with silver. There is one episode to feature wolves whose transformations seem a little less voluntary, but for the most part, lycanthropes became fodder monsters that could be slain without remorse because they're almost always just malicious little creeps. By the third appearance, there's basically no longer any tragic or scary elements to them, and eventually, it's revealed that there's a cure for lycanthropy, which removes the one lingering threat that they pose. There are plenty of easy fixes for this. Firstly, you could just not rely entirely on purebloods and sprinkle in a couple of more regular lycans to remind people that this is a tragic, horrific condition. That is, if you aren't willing to give them a cool monster form. One idea I had to get around their underwhelming appearance is that maybe the alpha actually does turn into a wolf monster. Then with every subsequent generation, they become less and less animalistic until you get to the point where they're just teeth and eyes and claws. Maybe there could have been an episode featuring a second generation werewolf whose wolf form looks closer to the wolf man. Admittedly, that could look really bad, but come on, it's just a little bit more hair and maybe wolf ears. I mean, the show doesn't usually have a lot of costumes or elaborate prosthetics, but it did have a few that looked pretty good. I don't know, man. Maybe I'm making a bigger deal of this than is warranted, but I mean, this is one of my favorite monsters, and I feel like the show did them extra dirty. I know I'm not alone, since the Winchesters actually did deliver a really cool-looking werewolf monster, proving that the CW is capable of serving up a sick lycanthropic beast. But what do you guys think? What's the most disappointing monster that Supernatural ever showed you? Let me know in the comments below. I'll have more content for you soon, but for now, carry on,